Interviewing as the art of making words fly. Hi, I am Monica Molina. Think of interviewing as the art of making words fly. It is not like baseball, where a pitcher wins by throwing balls that no one can hit. In an interview, you actually want the person to hit the ball. You throw questions that invite answers, strong and meaningful ones, that give you insight, data, stories. When you interview, your goal is to ask questions that spark ideas, that open doors, that bring out things you do not know. From those answers, you create data and later, research, articles, or even books. So, what is an interview really? At its core, it is a conversation. Sometimes it is one person asking and one person answering. Other times it can be a group like a focus group or even children who feel safer speaking with company. There are different styles. A structured interview is when all the questions are set beforehand and you stick to them. A semi-structured interview begins with planned questions, but you are open to adding, changing, or deepening as the conversation unfolds. And an unstructured interview feels more like a natural dialogue, where questions arise on the spot. Most researchers use semi-structured interviews because they give you a clear starting point, but also the freedom to adapt and go deeper. Now, here is something important. Your questions are not final. They are not a contract. They are just your best guess before you actually sit with people. You may need to modify them, replace them, or even add new ones as you learn. And sometimes, you may have to go back to someone you already interviewed because new questions come up later. Interviews can help you learn about past events that you cannot see anymore. This is the case with oral history, when people share their memories of key moments, like political changes or cultural traditions. Or life history, when you follow the story of one individual's journey. These interviews can preserve voices, challenge official versions, and show us perspectives that might otherwise be lost. But interviews are not only about the past. They can also reveal opinions and attitudes about current issues, like what teachers think of new curriculum reforms. You can learn how they feel, what challenges they face, and what solutions they imagine. That is the power of interviews. They let you go beyond what you can observe. They give you access to feelings, perceptions, and explanations. And sometimes, the best learning comes from unexpected answers, the moments you did not plan for, but that take the conversation in a whole new direction. So remember, interviewing is not just about asking, it is about listening, adapting, and letting words take flight. Let's talk about developing interview questions. Sometimes, new researchers confuse research questions with interview questions. But they are not the same. Research questions are about what you want to understand. Interview questions are what you actually ask to collect the data that will help you understand those things. Good interview questions are not just a copy of your research questions. They require creativity, insight, and connection with the people you are talking to. For example, if you are doing ethnographic research, you might first spend time observing people and their environment. What you see, hear, and experience can guide the questions you later ask. The questions should feel natural, rooted in the daily lives and cultural reality of your participants. Sometimes, questions come directly from the setting. Imagine a researcher interested in science education. Walking into a classroom, they might ask students about a project displayed on the wall. Another researcher might know what to ask because they have already observed classes, talked to teachers, or even taught similar lessons themselves. Questions are built from experience, from theory, and from listening to others in the field. Take Darren's study on high school dropouts who later returned to adult education. His questions came from both theory and experience. He asked, why did they leave school in the first place? How did their parents react? Did their friends also drop out? How did they hear about the adult program? And what was different in that program compared to high school? These questions reflected his thinking, his assumptions, and his knowledge of the topic. They did not form a full theory, but they showed the path he was taking to understand the phenomenon. The type of methodology you use also shapes the kind of questions you ask. Ethnography, for example, assumes that social behavior reflects cultural patterns, even if they vary from place to place. So, an ethnographer asks about practices, experiences, and meanings that reveal those cultural patterns. Narrative inquiry, on the other hand, focuses more on people's stories. It assumes that stories are a natural and authentic way to see how people give meaning to their lives. That is why narrative researchers often do multiple interviews, paying attention not only to what people say, but also to how they tell their stories. Other approaches, like post-structuralist theory, remind us that interviews are not neutral. If researchers pretend to be neutral, they might actually create a power imbalance where the interviewee is treated like an object. From this perspective, the interview is seen as a co-created process, a dialogue where both voices matter. This means that the way you ask questions can reveal as much about you as it does about the person answering. Now, shaping the actual questions is another challenge. Todd, for instance, interviewed parents about using portfolios to assess children in school. He noticed he had to spend almost a minute explaining each question, which showed him his wording was too complex. He had to make them simpler. Michael Patton gives great advice about this. He explains that there are categories of interview questions: experience questions, opinion questions, feeling questions, knowledge questions, sensory questions, and background questions. Experience and behavior questions are usually the easiest to answer and make a good way to start. Knowledge questions, on the other hand, can make people feel tested or embarrassed if they do not know the answer. In those cases, it might be better to get the information elsewhere instead of asking it in the interview. Another useful tip is to think about time. You can ask about the past, the present, or the future. But questions about the future often lead to vague answers, more like wish lists than deep insights. The past and present usually give richer stories and more useful data. Once you have your categories, the next step is shaping the questions carefully. Avoid yes or no questions, because they usually lead to short answers. Be careful with multiple questions packed into one, because the person may only answer one part and ignore the rest. And be cautious with why questions, because people may answer from many different angles, leaving you with a list of reasons, but not always a deeper understanding. Instead, break down your why into more specific questions, like asking separately about family influence, moral beliefs, or personal rewards. Let's keep exploring how to shape good interview questions. One powerful tool is the presupposition question. This type of question assumes that the person already has something to say. For example, instead of asking, "Are you satisfied with your volunteer work?" you might say, "Let's talk about your satisfaction and dissatisfaction with your volunteer work. Let's begin with the ways it has been satisfying for you." The presupposition is that there are both positives and negatives, but you are not leading them to one side or the other. And that is the difference. Presupposition questions invite people to share, but leading questions push people in a direction. Imagine saying, "Many people are selfish, never caring about problems like poverty or the environment. What made you get into volunteer work?" That would make it hard for someone to answer honestly if, for example, they only joined because a friend convinced them. A presupposition question is open, a leading one is not. Let me give you an example from Kelly Clark's study with women who were the first in their working-class families to attend college. She shaped her interviews over time, planning a series of conversations to build trust and depth. She started with easy, descriptive questions, what Spradley called grand tour questions. For instance, "Tell me about a typical day in your work." These are safe, comfortable, and experiential. Then she moved into slightly deeper ones, like, "How did you get involved in the work you do?" This helped her transition into the area she really wanted to explore, what it meant to these women to be first-generation academics. Clark planned at least 3 sessions with each participant. In the first, she focused on the journey to college and early self-perceptions. In the second, she explored more painful or complex issues like opportunities, choices, and systems of support. By the third, she was asking highly reflective questions, like how they aligned their sense of self with higher education. Because trust had been built, these conversations became more personal, even conversational, with back-and-forth sharing. This gradual process made it possible to ask about life's most meaningful experiences, what Denzin called epiphanies, the moments that leave deep marks on a person's life. But here is a key lesson. Do not jump too quickly into sensitive topics. Start with strengths, with what is working, as Lawrence Lightfoot did in her portraiture interviews. By beginning with positive experiences, both interviewer and interviewee could later move into the harder, darker parts of the story, without shutting down the conversation. Sometimes, especially with sensitive or controversial topics, it helps to change the voice of your question. Instead of asking directly, you might broaden it to, do people like you, or do people in your profession? This gives respondents a safer way to start answering, and often, the more they talk, the more personal their answers become. There is also the matter of timing. Some questions belong at the beginning because they are easy and help people relax. Some belong later because they require trust or build on earlier answers. And some, especially reflective ones, belong at the end. For example, in interviews with earthquake rescuers, Stuhl Miller waited until the end to ask, "What did you learn about yourself?" Or, "What advice would you have for others?" These questions helped participants leave the interview with a sense of growth, not just trauma. And of course, no matter how carefully you plan the order of your questions, real conversations do not always follow your script. People will answer in their own rhythm, making connections you did not expect. That is not a problem. That is part of the learning. So, as you design your interviews, keep asking yourself which questions are good for starting, which for building, which for ending, and how might your participants lead you to reorder them in surprising but meaningful ways. When it comes to creating interview questions, think of it not as a one-time task, but as an ongoing process, almost like a conversation between your topic, your questions, and your own reflections. At first, it's a three-way interaction. You, your topic, and the questions you begin to shape. And the key word here is tentative. Questions are not fixed. They change. You write them, check them against your topic, maybe even revise your research statement, and then return to the questions again. Later, this becomes a four-way interaction when collaborators come in. These are trusted peers, people who can read your drafts and give you honest feedback. They're not invested in your project, which is exactly why their logic and clarity are so valuable. They'll notice grammar, clarity, and whether your questions actually fit your topic. Sometimes, the best collaborators are those with lived experience, people familiar with the culture or context of your research. They can tell you whether your questions sound real, grounded, and relevant to the participants' lives. And if you're lucky, you might find local collaborators, people from the same community where your research takes place. The real challenge is this: to craft questions that participants find meaningful to answer, while also giving you rich, deep insights, pictures of what usually stays unseen, new perspectives that challenge assumptions, and knowledge that goes beyond the obvious. Once you have a draft, it's time to pilot your questions. Ideally, your pilot participants come from the same group you'll actually be studying. And here's the trick: don't just ask them to answer. Ask them to think critically about the questions themselves. Are they clear? Do they resonate? Do they open up reflection? Or do they fall flat? Of course, formal pilot studies aren't always possible. In that case, you can treat your first interviews as a kind of pilot phase. As long as you approach them with a commitment to revise, those first few conversations can guide you in reshaping your questions. Sean, who studied the experiences of first-generation college students, described it this way: "It was the pilot interview phase that most clearly informed my questions. Some of them resonated and sparked long, meaningful answers. Others just fell flat, sometimes figuratively during the interview, other times literally during the coding process." That's when research stops being just a plan on paper and becomes a real, human experience. You can almost hear the when a question doesn't work and the flow when one really does. And here's the truth: not every question will survive. Some will fall to the ground. And that's okay. Take Christina's project as an example. She was preparing to interview African women about their perceptions of legal rights. She drafted her questions, got feedback from classmates, pilot participants, and her professor, and then redrafted again and again. With each version, the questions became sharper, clearer, more powerful. Because how a question is worded really matters. Gobrium and Hallstein showed this beautifully. When interviewees were asked, "As you look back over your life, what are some of the milestones that stand out?" They spoke about professional achievements. But when the question was framed as, "If you were writing the story of your life, what chapters would you include?" participants gave richer, fuller narratives that stretched beyond just work. So yes, drafting and redrafting takes time and effort. But the payoff is huge. The quality of your data, the depth of your insights, they're only as strong as the questions you ask. So, let's talk about actually conducting the interview. First of all, where will it happen? You need a place that works for both you and your participants, somewhere quiet, comfortable, and private if possible. But here is the golden rule: defer to their needs. If the space they suggest is noisy or not private enough, that might hurt the quality of the conversation. But sometimes a gentle request like turning down a TV or radio does the trick. If you are interviewing students in schools, a classroom, or an office works great, but sometimes you will have to get creative, maybe the lunchroom, the auditorium, backstage, even a picnic table. Then there is the question of when the best time is: when both of you feel like talking, but again, you work with what is available in schools. That might be during a teacher's free period or a student study hall. Sometimes it is before or after school, or even at lunch. And how long should an interview last? About an hour of focused conversation is usually enough before both sides start to fade. But be flexible. Sometimes you'll only get a few minutes. Sometimes you will need several hours across multiple sessions. The key is to end in a way that keeps the door open, like saying same time and place next week. Now, how often should you meet? That depends on your project. Life histories can take many hours spread across several sessions. Topical interviews might require fewer, but still more than one. A good approach is to tell participants, I would like to meet with you at least 2 times, maybe more, but only as long as you feel comfortable. You can stop at any time, no explanation needed. That way you set expectations, but also give them full control. Here is a story. Stan was studying bilingual programs. He got 1 day a week off work and tried to squeeze in 5 or more interviews back to back. But what happened? He felt rushed. He could not reflect after each conversation, and his participants picked up on his stress. Their answers grew shorter, and he was not truly listening, just trying to get through his list. The lesson: quality over quantity. Better to schedule fewer, more thoughtful interviews, 2 a day at most, than to overload yourself. Of course, not every interview has to be face-to-face. Sometimes phone calls, video calls, or even email interviews can help. Online interviews save time and travel costs, and they let you reach people in different places, or people who might not feel comfortable meeting in person. Email interviews can even be great for participants who struggle with speech or who feel shy. But remember, email interviews are not just one exchange. They need to go back and forth over time to get real depth. Now, let's talk about the interactive nature of interviewing. No 2 interviews are ever the same. Who you are, who your participant is, the topic, the time, the place, all of that shapes the conversation. Your gender, your race, your age, your background, even your accent can influence how people respond to you. Sometimes you will need to adapt to cultural expectations, maybe sharing a meal before the interview, maybe allowing answers that come in the form of stories, not direct yes or no responses. And here is something important: there is no perfect interviewer. Just like in teaching or counseling, each person brings different strengths. Some researchers instantly inspire trust, others may stumble, but are so forgivable that participants keep opening up. Some create such a safe, reflective space that people line up to be interviewed. The point is, know yourself, use your strengths, and accept that not every interview will go brilliantly. Some will soar, others will flop. That is part of the process. And what is your number one job in the interview? Listening. Machines can record, but only you can listen, and not just passively listening, actively with your research goals in mind. Are your questions working? Should you probe deeper? Should you move on? The best probes usually cannot be scripted. They come from being present in the moment, thinking and talking on your feet. Listening also means watching. Pay attention to body language. Do you see discomfort, boredom, confusion? Is it because of the environment or because of your question? And then memory. You need to remember what has been said not only in this session but also in earlier ones. That way you can connect ideas, spot gaps, and avoid repeating yourself. And finally, remember the participant's experience. The interview is not just about data, it is also about how the other person feels while talking to you. If they feel respected and valued, they will open up more and may even tell others to participate. If they feel rushed or drained, the opposite happens. As Gubrium and Hallstein remind us, an interview is always a collaborative enterprise. Now, let's think about your role as an interviewer. See yourself not as a distant expert, but as a collaborator. Your job is to help people tell their stories. You guide the flow, but you also step back and let their voices lead. Sometimes you will hear things you disagree with, maybe even views that feel wrong or offensive, but remember, you are there as a researcher, not as a debater. Keep those roles separate. Bonnie learned this when she interviewed a nurse who had poor knowledge about caring for older patients. As a nurse, Bonnie wanted to correct her, but as a researcher, she had to listen without judgment. If she vented, she risked losing access to the stories she needed. Time also matters, especially in cultures that are time conscious. Keep your promise. If you say 1 hour, finish in 1 hour. That shows respect and keeps trust. Use the last minutes to summarize what you covered and point to what you'll explore next, then negotiate the next meeting. Always be punctual. Interviewing requires focus. You have to listen, watch, remember, connect, shut out the rest of your life for that time. Give the person your full attention. That level of concentration is exhausting. And honestly, if you are not tired at the end of an interview, you may not have gone deep enough. Remember, this is not about perfection. It is about growth. With each interview, you get better, just like teaching, you improve over time. Now, let's talk about probing. Good interviews are about going deeper, asking, tell me more. What else happened? How did that make you feel? The goal is not to rush through a list of questions, but to stay with an answer until it is fully explored. Patience is key. If you act satisfied with short answers, that is all you will get. But if you pause, lean in, and say, tell me more, your interviewee will open up. Probes can be silence, a nod, or a small sound like, aha. That silence gives space for thought. Sometimes it works better than a full question, but too much silence can make people uncomfortable. You have to find the balance. Other probes are more direct. You might say, I am not sure I understood. Can you explain again? Or did I get that right? And sometimes you ask for examples. That is powerful because people often answer first in general terms. Asking, can you give me an example, brings out details and stories. That is the richness you want. Even sketching can help. If someone describes a process, ask them to draw it, or you draw, and check if you got it right. Probing takes courage and patience. You will miss chances and later think, I should have asked more, but with practice you get better. Now, recording and transcribing. How will you capture the conversation? Notes, audio, video, each has pros and cons. Handwritten notes feel less intrusive, but they are hard to keep up with, and you may miss details. Recordings are fuller, but need consent and good equipment. Digital recorders are better than analog. External microphones or lapel mics give clearer sound. Even if you record, still take notes, jot keywords, gestures, questions. That way, if the recorder fails, you still have backup. And don't forget the field journal. After the interview, write down where it happened, who was present, how the participant behaved, and your reflections. This context makes the data stronger. Transcribing is the hard part. It takes hours, 4 hours for every 1 hour of recording. Some hire help, but that is expensive. And honestly, the best person to transcribe is you, because when you listen again, you hear new things, you reflect, you generate new questions. Self-transcription is painful, but it makes you a better researcher. Use tools to make it easier. A foot pedal software, time-coded notes, even voice recognition. If it works for you, whatever helps you stay close to the data. And track everything. Keep a record of who you interviewed, when, where, key characteristics, what you covered, what to revisit, and always back up your files. Computers crash, houses burn, drives get lost. Save copies in multiple places, because in qualitative research, your data are precious. Analyzing the data. Okay, so you've got hours of recordings, stacks of transcripts, maybe even pages of field notes. Now what? This is where many researchers feel overwhelmed, because suddenly you're staring at a mountain of words. The key is to remember, you're not just looking at text, you're looking for meaning. Analysis starts the moment you begin listening and transcribing. You're already noticing patterns, themes, contradictions, and surprises. But once all your interviews are in front of you, the work becomes more systematic. Some researchers go old school, scissors, tape, and color-coded highlighters, cutting transcripts into strips and organizing them into piles of themes. Others use software programs like NVivo, Atlas.ti, or MaxQDA to code and categorize digitally. The tools differ, but the goal is the same: break the data down into manageable pieces and then build it back up into insights. Here's the trick: you're not just counting words or looking for frequency. You're asking, what do these stories tell me about my research question? What's repeated, and what stands out as unique? Where do voices agree, and where do they clash? And don't forget context. A sentence doesn't stand alone. It lives inside a story, inside a life. That's why qualitative analysis is more art than formula.